Look into this image entitled The Holographic Cosmogram, then use your derived ethical comprehension to evaluate the actions of the current Trump administration, including the granted refugee status for Afrikaner South Africans. The Holographic Cosmogram and the Ethics of Selective Refugee Policy, an analysis of Trump's Afrikaner Resettlement Program. The Holographic Cosmogram presents a profound philosophical framework emphasizing interconnectedness, unity, and holistic relationships between individuals and communities. When applied as an ethical lens to evaluate the Trump administration's recent decision to grant refugee status to white South Afrikaners, it reveals significant contradictions between the policy's implementation and the principles of universal human dignity and interconnected justice. Understanding the Holographic Cosmogram. The image titled The Holographic Cosmogram presents a complex philosophical framework centered around the concept of Ubuntu, a traditional African philosophical principle. At its core, Ubuntu philosophy emphasizes the fundamental interconnectedness of human existence, often summarized by the phrase, "I am because we are." The cosmogram visually represents this principle through a geometric arrangement that connects various aspects of human experience. The cosmogram is structured with Ubuntu at the top, followed by relational pronouns I, we, you, me, us, them, mine, ours, yours, that emphasize the interplay between individual and collective identity. The hexagonal center contains mathematical sequences surrounded by 6 dimensions of existence: who, relational identity; what, material reality; why, purpose; how, experience and meaning; when, where, temporality and spatiality; and all, universality and pattern. This framework suggests an ethical worldview where actions must be evaluated within their complete context, considering their effects on the broader community and respect for the dignity of all people. Holographic principles and universal connection. The holographic nature of the cosmogram suggests that each part contains the whole A principle found in both Ubuntu philosophy and certain perspectives in theoretical physics. In holography, the information contained in any region of space can be thought of as encoded on the boundary of that region. Similarly, Ubuntu suggests that each person's humanity is inextricably bound with the humanity of others in a community. This holographic principle appears in several scientific contexts explored in the search results, from celestial holography 21 to holographic cosmology models. While these scientific applications differ from the philosophical concept, they share the fundamental insight that parts and wholes exist in complex, mutually defining relationships. The Trump administration's Afrikaner Refugee Program. In February 2025, the Trump administration implemented an executive order granting refugee status to South African Afrikaners, claiming they face persecution in their home country. The first group of 59 white South Africans arrived in Washington, D.C. in May 2025, having received expedited processing of their applications. Policy implementation and justification. President Trump has claimed that white Afrikaners in South Africa are victims of genocide, a claim that has been strongly rejected by the South African government. The refugee program specifically targets individuals who are of South African nationality, are of Afrikaner ethnicity, or members of a racial minority in South Africa, can articulate a past experience of persecution or fear of future persecution. Charles Kleinhaus, one of the refugees who arrived under this program, claims he faced threats to his property and life in South Africa. Trump advisor and South African-born Elon Musk has supported these claims, asserting there is a genocide of white people occurring in South Africa. Context and controversy. The implementation of this refugee program occurs against a backdrop of restricted refugee admissions from other regions, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and numerous sub-Saharan African nations. This selective application of refugee policy has raised significant questions about the administration's motivations and priorities in humanitarian protection. The South African government has vigorously disputed the claims of persecution against Afrikaners, describing them as completely false and attributing them to misinformation. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has labeled South Africans seeking refugee status in the U.S. as cowardly and has stated that he directly informed Trump that the information he was receiving from those opposed to transformation in South Africa is not accurate. Ethical evaluation through the holographic cosmogram. When we apply the philosophical framework of the holographic cosmogram to evaluate the Trump administration's Afrikaner refugee policy, several ethical inconsistencies become apparent. Selectivity versus universal interconnection. The Ubuntu philosophy at the heart of the cosmogram emphasizes that I am because we are a recognition that human dignity is universal and interconnected. The selective prioritization of one ethnic group over others appears to contradict this principle of universal human dignity and interconnection. While the cosmogram presents a balanced set of relationships between self and other, individual and community, the refugee policy creates an imbalanced system where certain groups receive preferential treatment. This selectivity becomes particularly problematic when considering the simultaneous restrictions placed on refugee programs for people fleeing documented persecution and conflict in regions such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and sub-Saharan Africa. The Ubuntu perspective would suggest that compassion and protection cannot be selectively applied without undermining their ethical foundation. Historical context and transformation. The holographic cosmogram includes temporal dimensions, when, where, that remind us to consider actions within their historical context. The Afrikaner minority in South Africa, approximately 2.7 million people out of a population of 62 million, are descendants of predominantly Dutch and French colonial settlers who enforced the apartheid system until 1994. This system fundamentally violated the Ubuntu principles of community and mutual recognition. South Africa's current land reform efforts, which Trump has characterized as confiscating land from white farmers, are better understood as attempts to address historical injustices within a constitutional framework. President Ramaphosa has emphasized that these efforts are about addressing the historical injustices of colonialism and the previous apartheid system that marginalized the Black majority. Truth and perception in policymaking. The How section of the cosmogram emphasizes reality, construction, perception, suggesting that ethical action requires an accurate understanding of reality. The claims of genocide against white South Africans have been widely discredited by experts. By basing policy on disputed claims rather than verified evidence, the administration may be undermining the principle of truth that underpins ethical decision-making. Community and individual rights. The All section of the cosmogram emphasizes equality, operation, quantity, suggesting that ethical systems must respect principles of equality. The selective application of refugee protection appears to prioritize the concerns of one community without equal consideration of others in similar or worse circumstances, creating an imbalanced approach to human rights protection. Implications and broader considerations. The tension between the Trump administration's selective refugee policy and the holistic ethics suggested by the holographic cosmogram raises important questions about the ethical foundations of humanitarian protection in international relations. Political motivations versus humanitarian principles. The South African government has labeled the U.S. Resettlement Initiative as politically motivated. This raises questions about whether humanitarian principles are being subordinated to political considerations, which would contradict the Ubuntu emphasis on authentic recognition of others' humanity. The role of media and information. Sam Busa, who founded Amerikaners, a platform to inform white South Africans about resettlement opportunities, represents how information networks shape perceptions of persecution and opportunity. The question of how information is constructed and shared becomes crucial to understanding the ethical dimensions of refugee policy. Perspectives on refugeehood. When questioned about the justice of receiving refugee status during a time of general refugee restriction, One applicant asserted that any farmer who has endured such an attack and wishes to flee should be regarded as a refugee. This perspective highlights differing conceptions of what constitutes refugee status, a legal protection traditionally reserved for those facing well-founded fears of persecution based on protected characteristics. Conclusion. The holographic cosmogram presents a vision of ethics grounded in interconnection, balance, and universal human dignity. When applied to evaluate the Trump administration's selective refugee policy for Afrikaner South Africans, this framework reveals significant ethical inconsistencies. While the protection of any group facing genuine persecution is aligned with humanitarian principles, the selective application of such protection, particularly when based on disputed claims and implemented alongside restrictions for other vulnerable populations, appears to contradict the holistic ethics of interconnection and equality. A truly ethical approach to refugee protection, as suggested by the holographic cosmogram, would require consistent application of humanitarian principles across all populations, accurate assessment of claims of persecution, and consideration of historical context in addressing current inequities. It would recognize that human dignity is universal and interconnected, that I am because we are, and that selective recognition of humanity undermines the very foundation of ethical action in global affairs. Would it be safe to say that such selective imbalance is a symptom of Yuguru mentality? Yes. Selective imbalance would indeed be considered a symptom of Yuguru mentality according to the African philosophical framework described in the search results. The concept of Yuguru, from Dogon mythology, represents a fundamental imbalance resulting from incompleteness and manifests through several key characteristics that align with selective treatment of different groups. According to the Dogon cosmology, Yuguru was born prematurely without his female twin soul, creating inherent incompleteness. This incompleteness led him to create an imperfect world characterized by disharmony and imbalance. The mythology describes how Yuguru is responsible for disorder in the universe. This being conceived in denial of the natural order, then acts to initiate and promote disharmony in the universe. Dr. Marimba Ani's application of this concept in her critique of European cultural thought highlights several relevant features. 1. Dichotomization. The Yuguru mentality creates artificial splits in reality, where realities are split then evaluated so that one part is better, which mandates its controlling function. This directly relates to selective policies that differentiate between groups. 2. Hierarchical valuation. First, the dichotomy is presented. Then the process of valuation occurs in which one term is valued and the other is devalued. This explains the selective prioritization of certain groups over others. Rejection of complementarity. Unlike African principles of twinness or appositional complementarity, the Yuguru mentality views differences as conflicting and threatening to one another rather than as complementary parts of a whole. The search results specifically note that this mentality stands in opposition to Ubuntu philosophy, which emphasizes wholeness created when female and male pairs join in all things. Such pairing establishes equilibrium, cooperation, balance, and harmony. Selective imbalance directly contradicts this principle of equilibrium and harmony. Dr. Francis Cress-Welsing's work, discussed in relation to Yuguru, further illuminates how such selective treatment reflects psychopathic behavior and strategies that attempt to balance the scales, no matter what it takes. So yes, selectively applying different standards to different groups would be considered a manifestation of Yuguru mentality, an expression of incompleteness, seeking to control rather than harmonize, creating imbalance rather than equilibrium.